Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm a ninth grade English teacher and a USA Today bestselling author. And on this week, I have a returning guest. This is my third opportunity to talk to W. Michael Farmer. And we're going to be following up on his last interview where we talked about part one of his story of Chato and his life and interactions with Geronimo. Book 2 is now out, and it is called Proud Outcast. Michael, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Farmer. I live now in Smithfield, Virginia. I used to live in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where I developed a serious interest in the culture of the country, both the Apaches and the ranchers. And I've written something like 20 novels, if you count what I've just finished, mostly about the years of Geronimo Wars and what happened to them after they became prisoners of war.
And as I mentioned, this is the second book in a duet telling this section of Chato's story. Remind our listeners a little bit about what you covered in the first book and then where we pick up here at the beginning of Proud Outcast.
The first book covered the years from about 1880 to 1886. Chato was what I would call a minor chief. He had one of the stronger small bands of Apaches that he led, and he generally stayed with Naiche, who was a Shokonan Apache and the son of the deceased Cochise. And over that span of years, he was very much a segundo, a number two, a chief lieutenant for Geronimo, and they got along very well. He was anxious to move up in the power structure and become a true big chief. And he was not too subtle in the way that he did things. And the big chiefs tended not to like him too well until they got into some serious conflicts. And then he was one of the main men who led the others. There came a time when just about all of the Chiricahua Apaches were in northern Mexico. They had escaped the San Carlos Reservation and had lived in Chihuahua up in the mountains there in the Sierra Madre. And he, along with Geronimo, and the others, Geronimo was a major war leader. He was never a chief. He was a medicine man. And for that matter, so was Chato, although some of his powers weren't nearly as great as Geronimo's. But the Apaches living in Mexico had been raiding across the border, giving the Anglos a really hard time. Finally, General Crook decided that they had to come back to the reservation if he was going to stop all of the raiding. And so he did one of the most daring raids that is recorded in Army history. He took about 200 Apache scouts, 50 troopers, and 70 mule pack trains and went into the Sierra Madre looking for the Apaches. It turned out that he had found a man who knew where the camps were and helped him find it. The Apaches in those camps were just dumbfounded, and he, without a lot of bloodshed, 2 or 3 people did get killed. He was able to get them to go back to San Carlos. And just prior to when this happened, this was in May of 1883, in the winter, Chato and a wife and 3 of their children were encamped, and the Mexican military raided it, managed to escape. The Mexicans, who were actually paramilitary Raramuri Indians, managed to take his wife and 2 young children into slavery, and he was devastated. He loved this wife dearly, and he immediately wanted to go after them, and Geronimo convinced him that no, they had to stay and wait because they would never find them, and the Mexicans were just too powerful for them to run in and snatch them without the danger of the families being killed. And so he waited and he waited. And finally, they rode off to take some Mexican captives of their own. And General Crook, with his Apache scouts and troops, appeared and took over the camp. And the Apache leaders were just astounded. They didn't believe that the Army would ever find them in the Sierra Madre where they were, or that they could get across the border without the Mexicans raising holy hell about it. And they all agreed to come back to San Carlos. Chato had a long talk with Crook, and Crook convinced him that he could use his political power to get his family back by going through the State Department and squeezing the Mexican government. The Chiricahuas settled down for a while until they got into a discordant situation with General Crook. It was a comedy of errors, but the bottom line was that Geronimo was able to lead about 30% of the Chiricahuas, about 120, off the reservation and back to Mexico. Prior to his leaving, he and Chato had a talk, and Chato knew that if there was a breakout, that all the help that Crook had promised to get his family back would go down the drain. They just wouldn't help them because they were uncooperative, and the Mexicans were being raided. And so Chato warned Geronimo, don't you leave or I'll bring you back in chains. Well, that set Geronimo off to telling him that he was a liar and a traitor and so on. Geronimo even tried to get a couple of his brothers to assassinate Chato and his commander, Lieutenant Britton Davis. Well, Chato wound up being Crook's main man in laying out a strategy for getting the Apaches back out of Mexico, and he was really the lead scout for trying to do that. But he spent like 4 months showing the Army through Mexico and helping them hit camps that the breakout Apaches had made. And he, like several of the other scouts, was just wore out and decided that he wouldn't re-enlist in November when his time was up and would go back to his farm at Fort Apache, where he was really doing very well with it. And he learned that winter that Geronimo had agreed to come in and talk peace in late March of 1886. And that's where the first book ends. Proud Outcast picks up where Chato is farming at Fort Apache and doing well. Geronimo with 40 of his people, 18 men and 22 women and 6 children, and had 5,000 of the U.S. Army after him, 3,000 Mexican military, and innumerable posses. And he never lost a man to capture or being killed. During that summer, General Miles, who had replaced General Crook, had decided that all the Chiricahuas needed to go back into exile in the east. The ones that had surrendered in March, including Geronimo until he changed his mind 3 days later, had been shipped to Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida. And they were really overcrowded, but they were making do. Fort Marion had room for about 70 people, and there were something like 100 there in 1886. General Miles was anxious to do a CYA so that he didn't get blamed for all the Apaches being shipped to the east, all the Chiricahuas being shipped to the east. And so he asked Chato to lead a delegation of 10 scouts and 4 women to Washington to ask President Cleveland, the Secretary of War, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs to let the scouts who had helped the Army stay where they were. They went, they were well received. They believed that they'd gotten a letter that basically said they had come for a visit. And they believed this letter was all they really needed to show that they had a right to stay on the reservation. Well, it was really one of the most shameful episodes in American history because as they were going back to their farms, they got as far as Fort Leavenworth. They were detained there for about a month, and then they were put on the train again, but this time they were shipped to Fort Marion. By this time, even with 10 more people, it was really getting very crowded. And when they shipped the rest a few weeks later of the people on the reservation to Fort Marion. They had something like 400 people there in a space that could comfortably hold 70, and it was a real horror show. Chato wound up being one of the leaders of the place, where they ensured that the Apaches kept the place clean and took care of themselves. But even so, they were dying like flies. The death rate for the Apaches there at Fort Marion was about 3 times the national average for the whites. And when Geronimo was finally surrendered and shipped east, they sent him to another fort, Fort Pickens in Pensacola, which was actually a much healthier and larger place and would have worked well. But Geronimo had surrendered under the understanding that he would be reunited with his family, which was at Fort Marion. Well, it didn't happen. They kept them separated. Fort Marion, Chato was approached by a woman who asked him to marry her 15-year-old daughter, who did not want to go to school at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And so he was starting to push 40 at that time, and a 40-year-old man marrying a 15-year-old girl was not quite what you would like to expect. But after he talked to the child, he decided that, yeah, he would go ahead and take her as a wife and basically wait on having children with her until she was 4 or 5 years older. Needless to say, that gave his first wife, who he had reunited with at Fort Marion, major heartburn, and they toleration situation where she wouldn't let the new wife come in her tent and vice versa. And so after a while, the Army decided that they were getting too much heat from the newspapers about all the Apaches dying there at St. Augustine. And so they shipped them to a place where they had a lot more space, but the actual health conditions were a lot worse. That was Mount Vernon Barracks, about 30 miles north of Mobile. And eventually, both the Chiricahuas from St. Augustine and those from Fort Pickens, i.e. Geronimo's people, reunited there at Mount Vernon, and there they stayed for about 8 years. Chato, along with several other men, actually wound up enlisting in the Army as a private and was treated directly as a regular soldier, as were the rest of the Apaches. It was entirely an Apache company of soldiers. When they eventually got what they thought was going to be their reservation at Fort Sill, he and his wife, who was now well into her 20s, had 2 little boys, and they started farming 40 acres. They were at Fort Sill in southwest Oklahoma. And eventually, Chato was both loved and hated by the Apaches. Those in Geronimo's group despised him as a traitor because that's what Geronimo said that he was. The others thought that he was a real peace leader. He tolerated both sides of the equation. Eventually, Geronimo passed away, and that was the key to getting the Chiricahuas free from being prisoners of war, which they had been for 27 years. And they could decide to stay around on the outside of Fort Sill because the Army wanted Fort Sill back. They had planned to give it up, and part of the Chiricahuas got land around Fort Sill, although it wasn't nearly as much as what they were promised. And the others decided that they wanted to go back west, and the Army let them, and the Mescaleros invited them to come stay on their reservation there in Mescalero, New Mexico. And there, Chato and his wife wound up living alone at the top of Apache Pass, which is on the road that goes between Mescalero and Ruidoso, New Mexico. And the place where they lived, while it had good grass and he could raise a few cattle and horses, it really didn't have any well or normal source of water. And so for all those years, he wound up hauling water about 40 miles round trip from the agency in barrels in a wagon for them to live on while their stock drank from ponds. Around 19 1935, the story goes that he and some friends were in his T-model truck sitting back in a canyon. They got a sloot full of whiskey and tried to drive back. And it's said that he drove off into a creek and was trapped in the cold water until his friends could get him out. And that was nearly all night that he was there. And he died about 13 days later from lumbar pneumonia. Many historians question whether or not it was actually an accident, and the Apaches at Mescalero kind of hint that maybe it was not an accident, and that people that wanted to get some revenge against Chato for being a traitor, quote, quote, did him in. A lot of historians also say that he was Geronimo's doppelganger, that there are just amazing parallels between their lives. Chato died from pneumonia after laying half drunk in cold water all night, and that's exactly what happened to Geronimo about 25 years earlier. They both lived in the same reservations. They both lost families to the Mexican military who were after them in slaves, and they lost much of their family to disease. And they were horrific raiders in their younger days. And so he has really been a fascinating character, at least for me, to study and write about.
I bet. And that does, talking about the parallels between them, I think it's really interesting that it highlights the differences that those choices made in their lives on how they chose to deal with the situations. Because in so many of the cases you write about, their choices were very limited. They were just kind of losing ground on many fronts and had to figure out how to manage it in order to stay where they wanted to stay at times, to keep their families together, just to try to protect themselves. And even though, as you mentioned, they're coming together on a lot of the major points, a lot of those smaller things that come up and those individual decisions that they make do bring up some important differences that you point out in this really individualized perspective of Chato's life and this section of them being prisoners of war. I wanted to ask you a little bit about just how you got down to that individual perspective. I know you've done extensive research. And that can be, I think, a challenge to take all of the timelines and locations and following everything through this journey of this whole group of people and then putting that into one person's perspective. How did you go about that? Because I think that might be something really challenging for a lot of authors, especially someone who's interested in historical fiction but new to the task.
Well, the thing that I liked about the information that I had about Chato was that it was what a lot of people would call secondary information. There is an extraordinary number of historical papers and records and books about him, and really are about the Chiricahua Apaches. If you understand their culture and why they did certain things in a particular way, and then you overlay that with the history of what went on, and there's just a ton of reports, both oral history and written military reports, that give you a pretty clear picture of what happened. And within those things, what you wind up finding are these gaps, and then a scene or two where it's just extraordinarily hard to understand why they did what they did, even given their culture. And so my advice to authors wanting to write historical fiction about particular characters, you need to get as much of their hard history as you can, and then look for the cracks in the story where you can fill in with your imagination what must have actually gone on.
I think that's such a great point of starting with what you can, getting as much detail as possible. And I think it's interesting, so much of Native American history is not recorded first person. So a lot of the
Yeah,
times you're coming across other people's accounts and other people insights and thoughts about the events, but also the people. And I know we talked about this
yeah,
with one of your other books as well,
right,
but kind of trying
right.
to interpret that other person's view of the person you're writing about. And I was interested in if you kind of have to filter and adjust from maybe one person's view being a little bit different from another person's view in some of the accounts of those interactions and how you dealt with that.
Well, yeah, you're spot on there. The actually before I wrote this story of Chato, I wrote Geronimo's story, and you get these little glimpses of Chato in Geronimo's story that are kind of unexpected. But what you really have to do is apply the third leg of the stool, if you will, and that is the psychology of the humanity of these people. You know, the great storytelling in the United States back in the 1950s in the Western genre was the Apaches were basically bloodthirsty savages, but in fact, they were humans just like we are. And when you overlay their culture and the psychology that you know must exist there, then that really helps you kind of grasp what's really going on. And so, you know, the culture, the the hard history that they survived, and the human psychology, the personalities that were there. I think that's what you really wind up having to understand to get a fairly good picture of what must have been going on.
I really like that advice, just making sure that you're coming at it from all aspects and not relying too much on one thing or the other. Because if I would think if you do that, you're kind of going to miss some important part of who that person was and what they were living through. So I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that. I did want to ask
Sure.
you, because as you mentioned, there's several aspects of this story that deal with some sensitive topics that can be hard to discuss and bring into the story, but also just think about the reader reaction and how much, how little to go into everything. And this is published by Hat Creek, which is an imprint of Roan and Weatherford Press. And so I was wondering kind of what their process was and how that maybe impacted or worked with you on your reading of dealing with these sensitive topics. Did you have sensitivity readers or some sort of, in the editorial process, going through any of those topics? How did you approach some of the difficult things, like the broken agreements and the massive amount of death, and even down to his marriage to the young woman and the age difference there?
Well, I've been very happy with Hat Creek, aka Rowan Weatherford, and they take my manuscripts as they are, and just be sure that you know the technical aspects of it are correct, that the history is right, and they have not given a lot of thought to the sensitivity that seems to float around in some areas. But I have been surprised by my readers who have told me that, you know, I try to tell it like it is, and they get that very, very well. And when you do that, I think you wind up learning to accept people in different cultures and times and situations in a way that recognizes their humanity. And so I may be beating around the bush here on your question, but my publisher has never said, well, no, you can't say that. That's not kosher these days.
Well, I'm glad that they have given you that room to really make sure that you can tell the story the way that you feel is best and in an accurate way. That I think you bring a lot of different aspects into your story, and that comes through as you're telling it. We are just about out of time, so I wanted to make sure that we give our listeners a reminder of both the books of Desperate Warrior and Proud Outcast. And tell us
Right.
a little bit about where people can find you and where they can go out and purchase the books if they would like to learn a little bit more about Chato's history.
The books are widely available. You can get them through Amazon or Barnes and Noble, any of the online stores. They're available as ebooks. And occasionally, if you're deep in the West, you'll find, and you find a bookstore, you'll probably find them on the shelf there. But you can get a good look at my work on my website, wmichaelfarmer.com. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can send me an email through the website, and I'll be glad to chat with you about it.
And do you have anything that we can keep an eye out for coming up next, or are you figuring out where you're going from here?
Yeah, actually, the Ronan Weatherford is publishing my backlist, and so they are close. I think this fall will come out with Trini Come, which is the story of Geronimo's captivity of Trinidad Verdun. I have two volumes, very similar to the way that I did Chato, about Apache Kid, who was one of the most feared outlaws in the border area at the turn of the last century. And it's really an extraordinary story. And you mentioned all of the things you have to pull together to get a coherent story out of it. There's so many conflicting stories, and some that are just flat dead wrong about Apache Kid, that it was a real slog to get the stuff straight and right. And the first volume of those two is due to come out next summer, sometime in June, I think, and it will be called Chronicles of Apache Kid, Army Scout, and that one will be followed by the Chronicles of Apache Kid, Vanishing Outlaw.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to hearing more about those. And for people interested in the story of Trinidad, that was the first time I was able to talk to Michael, and you can check out our previous interview on that one as well. But I just want
I might point out that Trini Come is a finalist for the New Mexico Arizona Book Awards, both for historical fiction in Arizona, and for young adult reading.
Oh, that's awesome.
So yeah, they're supposed to announce who won the award and who remains finalist Monday, I think.
Awesome. Well, best of luck on that. I'll have to keep an eye on their list. I usually check that out each year to see what's going on. But yeah, that's fairly exciting. And we are out of time. That went by really fast, but I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to come on the show and for giving me a chance to read Proud Outcast. It was a really fascinating read, and I look forward to your next one.
Well, thank you, DelSheree. I very much appreciate your support.